They thought throwing Naomi Vale out into the rain would protect the family's reputation. What they didn't know was that within the next 15 minutes, a helicopter would land on the Whitmore estate lawn, and every person in that ballroom would wish they had treated her differently. Get her out of here. Victoria Vale's voice sliced through the ballroom with such cold precision that even the violin quartet near the staircase faltered for half a second. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors as conversations around the gala slowly died into uncomfortable silence. Naomi stood near the center of the room, still wearing her faded navy EMT jacket over a plain charcoal dress, rainwater darkening the fabric around her shoulders. A faint smear of dried blood stained one sleeve from the emergency call she had left barely an hour earlier. Across the ballroom, women in silk gowns exchanged glances over champagne glasses. One man quietly whispered something that made another guest smirk behind his drink. Naomi noticed all of it. Every stare, every tiny expression, every judgment. Victoria stepped closer, diamonds flashing beneath the warm golden lights. "This is a family foundation gala," she said sharply. "Not a homeless shelter." A few nervous laughs escaped somewhere near the back of the room. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had spent 19 straight hours pulling victims out of a highway pileup outside Hartford. She was too exhausted for rich people pretending cruelty was sophistication. "I came because Ethan asked me to," Naomi replied quietly. Her voice remained calm, which somehow irritated Victoria even more. "Ethan is finalizing $1 billion acquisition tonight," Victoria snapped. "He does not have time to babysit embarrassment." The room went still again. Naomi could feel hundreds of eyes measuring her jacket, her tired face, the loose strands of blonde hair escaping her messy bun. She suddenly became aware of how badly she did not belong in this room filled with tailored tuxedos and old money smiles. Then came the final blow. Cassandra Vale, Ethan's older sister, lifted her wine glass and laughed softly. "Honestly, she looks like she wandered in through the service in trance." This time the laughter spread wider. Not loud. Worse. Controlled. Polite. The kind of laughter designed to humiliate someone without leaving fingerprints. Naomi felt heat rise beneath her skin. Not because of the insult. Because she realized Ethan still wasn't there. Victoria turned toward two security guards standing near the ballroom entrance. "Escort her outside." One of the guards hesitated. The older one recognized Naomi immediately from local news coverage after she helped rescue children during a winter bus accident months earlier. But Victoria's glare hardened. "Now." Naomi slowly picked up the worn canvas bag she had placed beside her chair earlier that evening. The guests watched her the same way people watched accidents on highways. Curious, detached, relieved it wasn't happening to them. As she walked toward the grand entrance, someone muttered, "Poor Ethan." Another voice whispered back, "This marriage won't last." Naomi paused for the briefest second near the towering front doors. Rain hammered against the glass outside. Behind her, the orchestra awkwardly resumed playing, as if music could erase what had just happened. Then the estate lights suddenly flickered once. Several guests looked upward in confusion. A valet hurried through the side hallway whispering urgently into his earpiece. Somewhere outside beyond the rain and darkness, the deep rhythmic sound of helicopter blades began cutting through the night air. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Vale's confident smile disappeared. The sound grew louder by the second, low and mechanical, vibrating through the rain-soaked estate grounds until even the orchestra inside the ballroom lost rhythm again. Guests drifted toward the towering windows overlooking the front lawn, their confusion spreading in quiet ripples across the marble floor. Naomi stood alone beneath the massive stone arch outside the mansion entrance, cold rain dripping from loose strands of blonde hair onto her exhausted face. Her canvas medical bag rested against her leg, while the two security guards beside the doors avoided eye contact entirely. One of them finally spoke under his breath. "Ma'am, I am sorry about this." Naomi gave a tired nod, but said nothing. She had learned years ago that humiliation became worse when witnesses tried to soften it afterward. Behind the glass doors, silhouettes moved rapidly now. Wealthy donors, board members, politicians, and investors crowded near the windows like spectators waiting for some kind of announcement. Then the helicopter emerged through the rain clouds above the estate grounds, black against the stormy Connecticut sky. Wind tore across the lawn as the aircraft slowly descended toward the private landing area beside the fountain courtyard. Several women grabbed their dresses against the gusts. Valets rushed forward. Someone inside whispered, "That is Ethan's aircraft." The entire energy of the evening shifted instantly. Naomi closed her eyes briefly as the cold wind struck her face. She already knew what was about to happen. Inside the ballroom, Victoria Vale's confidence began cracking around the edges. Why was nobody informed he landed early? She demanded sharply toward the event coordinator. No one answered. Across the room, Cassandra lowered her champagne glass, suddenly far less amused than she had been moments earlier. Through the rain-streaked glass, the helicopter door opened. Ethan Vale stepped down onto the wet pavement in a dark charcoal overcoat, one hand adjusting the cuff of his sleeve while rain rolled off his shoulders. Even from a distance, his presence carried the kind of authority money alone could never buy. The pilots remained near the aircraft while Ethan moved quickly toward the mansion entrance, accompanied by two executives struggling to keep pace beside him. "He looks furious," one donor quietly murmured. Naomi heard the front doors unlock behind her before she even turned around. The older security guard immediately stepped aside. Ethan stopped the moment he saw her standing there alone beneath the rain-covered archway. For one silent second, the billionaire businessman everyone feared in boardrooms looked at nothing except the soaked EMT jacket still clinging to his wife's shoulders. His expression changed instantly. Not explosive anger. Worse, cold realization. "Naomi," he said quietly, stepping closer. "Why are you outside?" The warmth in his voice almost broke her composure more than the humiliation itself. Naomi glanced past him toward the glowing ballroom behind the glass. "Your family handled it." Ethan followed her eyes toward the crowd gathering inside the mansion doors. Executives, politicians, investors, all pretending not to stare while absolutely staring. Then Ethan noticed the faint bloodstain on her sleeve. His jaw tightened. "You came straight from work." Naomi nodded once. Three-car rollover on Interstate 91. A teenager coded twice. Ethan exhaled slowly, rain running down the side of his face as pieces finally connected in his mind. His mother had thrown out a woman who had spent the day saving strangers while half the ballroom inside spent the evening discussing tax shelters over imported wine. The silence between them deepened. Then Ethan removed his overcoat without hesitation and draped it over Naomi's shoulders himself. Through the glass walls, every guest inside the ballroom saw it happen. And suddenly nobody in that mansion seemed comfortable anymore. The ballroom doors opened slowly as Ethan guided Naomi back inside beside him, his hand resting firmly against the middle of her back beneath the oversized charcoal coat now draped around her shoulders. Nobody resumed their conversations this time. The only sound left in the enormous room was the soft clink of crystal glasses being lowered onto tables as guests suddenly became very interested in avoiding eye contact. Naomi could feel it immediately. The shift. 20 minutes earlier they had looked at her like she was beneath the room. Now they were watching her like she carried information capable of destroying careers. Ethan walked her directly through the center of the ballroom without rushing, without acknowledging anyone who stared. Rainwater still darkened the edges of Naomi's boots as they crossed the polished marble floors. One donor instinctively stepped aside to let them pass. Another quickly lowered his phone after realizing he had been recording. Near the grand staircase, Victoria Vale forced a tight smile back onto her face. "Ethan," she began carefully. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Ethan stopped walking. The room froze with him. Naomi remained beside him silently, exhaustion visible beneath her eyes now that adrenaline had faded. Her hands were still cold from standing outside in the storm. Ethan looked first at the security guards near the entrance. "Did my mother ask you to remove my wife from this house?" The younger guard swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Victoria stepped forward quickly. "Ethan, please. The guests do not need. Answer the question." His voice never rose. That made it worse. The older guard nodded once. "Yes, sir." Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, someone quietly set down a champagne glass too hard against a table. The sound cracked through the silence. Ethan turned slowly toward his mother. "You threw Naomi outside while she was still wearing a trauma response jacket." Victoria lifted her chin defensively. This was a formal gala. She arrived looking inappropriate, and she arrived after saving lives. His words landed like stones across the room. Cassandra folded her arms. Nobody knew what she had been doing. Ethan looked at her coldly. You knew enough not to laugh at her. Cassandra's expression shifted instantly. Across the ballroom, several guests who had laughed earlier suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable. Naomi noticed one woman quietly move her chair farther away from Cassandra's table, as if distance itself might erase association. Ethan finally turned toward Naomi herself. His expression softened for the first time all evening. How long were you standing outside? Naomi shrugged faintly. Long enough. He studied her face carefully, noticing details nobody else in the room would have seen. The slight tremor in her fingers from exhaustion. The dark shadows beneath her eyes. The tiny dried scratch near her jaw from shattered windshield glass during the highway rescue earlier that day. Then his gaze moved toward the ballroom crowd again. Do any of you know where my wife was before she came here tonight? Nobody answered. Ethan nodded once, almost to himself. At 4:30 this afternoon, Naomi climbed into an overturned vehicle on Interstate 91 while gasoline leaked across the pavement. The room became perfectly still. A 17-year-old girl survived because my wife stayed inside that wreck until emergency crews cut the door open. Several guests exchanged startled looks now. One older investor frowned in recognition. That rescue was on the news, he murmured quietly. Ethan continued without looking away from the crowd. While half this room spent the evening discussing stock portfolios, Naomi spent hers holding pressure on a stranger's collapsed lung. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the first time that night, the wealthiest people in the ballroom suddenly looked very small. Victoria Vale had spent 30 years controlling rooms exactly like this one. Charity boards, political dinners, museum galas. She understood social power better than most people understood language itself. But standing beneath the chandelier glow, while dozens of donors silently watched her son defend the woman she had just thrown into the rain, she realized something terrifying. The room was no longer on her side. Ethan, she said carefully, forcing composure back into her voice. Nobody is questioning what Naomi does for work. This is about presentation. Tonight matters for the foundation. Ethan looked around the ballroom slowly. You are right, he said. Tonight does matter. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. Naomi remained quiet beside him, one hand still gripping the strap of her weathered medical bag. She wished more than anything that the night would simply end. The attention pressing against her skin now felt almost as exhausting as the rescue scene earlier that afternoon. But Ethan was not finished. He walked toward the center stage near the orchestra platform where a massive screen displayed the Vale Foundation crest in gold lettering. Every eye in the ballroom followed him automatically. Most of you believe tonight is about celebrating the expansion of the Vale Family Investment Network, he said calmly. That is what you were invited to believe. A ripple of confusion spread across the room. Victoria's expression tightened. Ethan, she warned softly. He ignored her completely. 6 months ago, my wife proposed something I initially thought was impossible. Naomi immediately looked at him. This was not part of the evening plan they had discussed. Ethan continued anyway. Naomi wanted to create a national emergency response grant for underfunded rural paramedic units across the Northeast. Several guests straightened in visible surprise now. One older senator lowered his wine glass entirely. Ethan pressed a button on the presentation console near the stage. The screen behind him changed instantly from the Vale family crest to photographs of ambulance crews, volunteer rescue workers, exhausted first responders, and damaged emergency vehicles from small towns across Connecticut and Vermont. The room went silent all over again. Over the last year, Ethan said, my wife spent every day documenting departments operating without enough staff, outdated cardiac monitors, broken extraction equipment, and ambulances with over 300,000 miles. Naomi stared at the screen in disbelief. Ethan had listened to every story she told him after overnight shifts. Every frustration. Every exhausted conversation at 2 in the morning over cold coffee. He had remembered all of it. Cassandra stepped forward sharply. What does this have to do with tonight? Ethan turned toward her with terrifying calm. Everything. He looked back at the crowd. The Vale Foundation is restructuring effective immediately. The air itself seemed to tighten. Beginning tonight, 70% of all future foundation capital will move away from luxury art sponsorships and into emergency medical infrastructure. Audible reactions spread across the ballroom now. Shock, confusion, panic. One board member nearly choked on his drink. Another whispered, 70%. Victoria's face lost color for the first time all evening. You cannot make that decision alone. Ethan's eyes met hers directly. Actually, I can. Then came the final blow. Because the new director of the foundation will be Naomi Vale. Complete silence crashed over the ballroom. Naomi herself looked stunned. Several guests slowly turned toward her. Standing there in worn boots and a faded EMT jacket beneath the billionaire's coat. The same woman they had laughed at less than an hour earlier. And suddenly every person in that mansion understood the same thing at once. The woman they dismissed as an embarrassment had just become the most powerful person in the room. For several long seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. The enormous estate that had once felt loud with wealth and status now carried the suffocating stillness of people realizing they had misjudged someone too late to recover gracefully. Naomi stood near the orchestra platform staring at the massive presentation screen behind Ethan, still trying to process what he had just done. You never told me, she said quietly. Ethan looked at her with the same calm certainty that had built one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. Because if I had, you would have tried to stop me. A few nervous chuckles escaped from scattered corners of the ballroom, but they died almost instantly. Nobody was relaxed anymore. The balance of power had shifted too completely. Victoria stepped toward the stage again, her posture rigid with controlled panic. This foundation was built by our family, she said carefully. You are allowing emotion to interfere with business. Ethan turned toward the guests instead of answering her directly. Do you know what Naomi asked me after she reviewed the financial projections for this initiative? The room remained silent. Ethan continued. She asked if we could delay renovating our Aspen property for another year because one department in rural Maine still uses ambulance radios from 1998. Several people visibly lowered their eyes. Naomi felt heat rise into her face, uncomfortable hearing private conversations exposed in front of strangers. Ethan noticed immediately. Even now, after everything, she looked embarrassed by attention rather than hungry for it. That was exactly why he trusted her with the foundation. Cassandra folded her arms tightly. You are turning this organization into a charity project. Naomi finally spoke. Her voice remained soft, but the exhaustion in it somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. It already is a charity project. The room shifted again. Several heads slowly turned toward her. Naomi stepped forward slightly, still wrapped in Ethan's coat. The difference is that some charities save reputations, she said quietly, and some save people. Nobody interrupted her. She glanced toward the giant ballroom windows where rain still streaked across the dark glass outside. Last winter, I responded to a cardiac arrest in a town so underfunded their backup ambulance came from 42 miles away. A few guests exchanged uneasy looks now. Naomi continued without drama, without performance. The patient survived. Barely. Not because the system worked. Because exhausted people kept trying anyway. One older donor, near the front table, slowly removed his glasses. Across the room, a senator who had supported several luxury arts grants shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Naomi looked down briefly at her worn boots against the polished marble floor. I do not know anything about social rankings, she admitted softly. I do not know what silverware belongs at which course or which last names matter in Connecticut. A few people visibly flinched hearing their own world described so plainly. But I know what it sounds like when someone stops breathing. Complete silence followed. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Ethan watched her with unmistakable pride now. Not because she had impressed the room. Because she had stayed exactly who she was despite every reason to become bitter. Victoria looked around the ballroom and finally understood the disaster unfolding around her. The guests were no longer admiring the Vale family. They were admiring Naomi. Worse than that, they respected her. And respect was something money could never fully buy back once lost. Then one of the wealthiest investors in the room slowly began clapping. The sound echoed sharply beneath the chandeliers. Another donor joined. Then another. Within seconds, the ballroom filled with applause so overwhelming it almost felt unreal. Naomi froze completely. Less than an hour earlier, these same people had watched her get thrown into the ring. Now they were standing for her. And the people clapping the least were the members of the Vale family themselves. The applause continued longer than anyone expected. Not the polite kind performed out of obligation at charity events, but something heavier, genuine, uneasy, almost corrective. Naomi stood motionless beneath the chandelier light, while wealthy strangers applauded the same woman they had silently judged an hour earlier. She could feel the contradiction hanging in the room. Ethan watched the crowd carefully. Years in business had taught him how to read people within seconds. Some guests looked inspired. Others looked ashamed. A few looked terrified about which side of the evening history would remember them standing on. Victoria Vale remained perfectly still near the stage staircase, but her expression had hardened into something colder now. Not anger anymore. Calculation. Damage control. Ladies and gentlemen, she said suddenly, stepping forward with controlled grace. Perhaps we should all take a moment to calm down before making emotional decisions. The applause weakened slightly. Naomi immediately recognized the shift in tone. Victoria was trying to reclaim the room. The Vale Foundation has obligations. Victoria continued smoothly. Long-standing partnerships. Cultural investments. International commitments. Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. You mean opera wings and yacht auctions? A few uncomfortable laughs escaped nearby tables. Victoria ignored them. This family built influence through decades of discipline and careful reputation management. Then her eyes moved toward Naomi. Not through emotional storytelling. The insult landed quietly this time, but everyone heard it. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly. Exhaustion was finally catching up to her. Her shoulders ached. Her head still carried the distant ringing of sirens from the highway crash earlier that day. She no longer wanted revenge or validation. She just wanted the night to end. But before Ethan could respond, another voice cut across the ballroom. Actually, I think she is the first honest thing this foundation has seen in years. The crowd turned immediately. It was Leonard Mercer, one of the oldest investors associated with the Vale family empire. At 72, Mercer rarely spoke publicly unless he intended every word to matter. He slowly approached Naomi with his cane tapping softly against marble. "Young lady," he said gently, "my grandson survived a skiing accident in Vermont 3 years ago because an exhausted paramedic refused to stop CPR during a snowstorm." Naomi blinked in surprise. Mercer nodded toward her EMT jacket. "People like you kept my family whole." The room fell silent again. Mercer then turned toward Victoria with quiet disappointment. "And tonight your family threw one of those people into the rain because her boots did not match the carpet." Nobody moved. Nobody defended Victoria this time. Cassandra suddenly picked up her wine glass and walked toward the opposite side of the ballroom, avoiding every camera phone now discreetly pointed in their direction. Ethan noticed immediately. So did everyone else. The social unraveling had begun. Naomi finally spoke again, softer than before. "Mr. Mercer, I was only doing my job." The old investor smiled sadly. "Exactly." His answer settled over the ballroom like a final verdict. Across the room, several board members quietly approached Ethan's executive team asking questions about the emergency medical initiative. The momentum had already shifted beyond recovery. Victoria saw it happening in real time. Decades of carefully cultivated influence slipping away not because of scandal or bankruptcy, but because one tired paramedic walked into her mansion wearing the truth instead of diamonds. Ethan stepped beside Naomi again and gently took her cold hand in his. This time, nobody looked at her boots. Nobody laughed at her jacket. And the mansion that once treated her like an outsider now felt strangely uncertain about who truly belonged there at all. The gala should have ended an hour earlier, but nobody wanted to leave now. Conversations had broken into tense little clusters across the ballroom, while staff quietly refreshed untouched champagne glasses and half-finished dinners no one seemed interested in anymore. The entire mansion carried the strange atmosphere of a place where something irreversible had happened. Naomi sat briefly near the edge of the ballroom, beside one of the tall windows overlooking the rain-covered estate grounds. Her exhaustion had settled deep into her bones now. She rubbed at the bridge of her nose for a moment before glancing toward the dance floor where investors, politicians, and socialites continued whispering about her as though she could not hear them. Only now the whispers sounded different. Respectful, curious, careful. Ethan approached carrying 2 cups of coffee from the catering station himself instead of sending staff. Naomi noticed several guests watching that small detail closely. Billionaires in rooms like this rarely carried anything for anyone. He handed her one of the cups. Black. 2 sugars. Naomi gave the faintest smile. You remembered. You say that every time. His voice softened slightly. And every time I remember. For the first time that evening, some of the tension around Naomi's eyes eased. Not because of the room. Not because of the applause or the foundation announcement. Because Ethan still saw her the same way he always had. Across the ballroom, Victoria noticed the interaction too. Her expression tightened again. She approached slowly, posture perfectly composed despite the humiliation she had suffered all evening. Several nearby guests immediately pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Naomi, Victoria said carefully. Perhaps we started tonight poorly. Ethan's expression cooled instantly, but Naomi answered first. Perhaps. Victoria folded her hands elegantly. You must understand something about families like ours. There are expectations. Appearances matter. Naomi looked down briefly at the paper coffee cup, warming her hands. Do they matter more than people? Victoria hesitated. Just long enough. The silence that followed said everything. Nearby guests exchanged subtle glances again. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying his mother with the detached calm of someone finally seeing a situation clearly after years of avoiding it. Victoria attempted another approach. The foundation announcement blindsided the board. Surely we can discuss a compromise. Privately. Ethan shook his head once. The years for private discussions passed a long time ago. Those words hit harder than shouting would have. Naomi noticed something shift across Victoria's face then. Not outrage. Regret. Real or not, it was there. Because for the first time, she understood this was not merely about one embarrassing evening. She was losing her son. Across the room, a young event assistant accidentally dropped a silver serving tray after noticing several reporters gathering near the mansion entrance outside. The sharp metallic crash echoed through the ballroom. Everyone turned immediately. One of Ethan's executives approached, quickly holding a tablet. Sir, he said quietly. The helicopter landing was photographed. Social media already picked up the foundation announcement. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. Ethan barely reacted. How bad? The executive hesitated. Actually, not bad for us. He turned the tablet screen around. Headlines and local media posts were already spreading online. Billionaire restructures family foundation after EMT wife humiliated at gala. Rural emergency services to receive historic funding. Naomi stared at the screen in disbelief. Her entire life, she had avoided attention whenever possible. Now the entire state was talking about her within minutes. Ethan looked at her carefully. You okay? Naomi exhaled slowly. I handled a 6-car pileup today. She glanced toward the ballroom, filled with wealthy people, suddenly terrified of public opinion. This somehow feels stranger. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath for the first time all night. And nearby, more than one guest suddenly realized the woman they once dismissed had something far more dangerous than money now. She had public respect. And unlike inherited wealth, that kind of power could not be taken away. By nearly midnight, the storm outside had weakened into a cold, steady drizzle. But inside the Vale mansion, the atmosphere remained tense enough to feel electric. Staff members moved carefully through the ballroom as though afraid to make noise. Conversations dropped the moment Ethan walked past. Phones glowed discreetly beneath tables while guests refreshed news feeds that continued spreading Naomi's story across Connecticut and beyond. What had begun as a polished society gala was rapidly becoming a public relations disaster for the Vale family and an unexpected national spotlight for rural emergency workers. Naomi stood alone for a brief moment near the massive staircase, staring at one of the framed oil portraits lining the walls. Generations of the Vale family watched from gold-trimmed canvases with cold, dignified expressions. Men in military uniforms, women in pearls and silk gloves. Every portrait carried the same old money certainty that power belonged naturally to them. They would have hated me too, Naomi said quietly. Ethan approached beside her with his hands in his coat pockets. Probably. She glanced at him, surprised by the honesty. Ethan studied the portraits for another second before adding, That is why I stopped trying to become them years ago. Naomi looked back toward the ballroom, where Victoria was speaking urgently with board members near the far corner. She really believes appearances matter more than people. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. My mother grew up learning that reputation is survival. Naomi crossed her arms loosely, exhaustion still visible in every movement now. And what did you learn? Ethan looked at her directly. That reputation without character is just expensive theater. The words lingered between them. Nearby, a pair of young donors pretending to admire the staircase flowers immediately stopped whispering once they realized Ethan had noticed them listening. Then the ballroom doors opened again. A line of local reporters entered cautiously beside the event coordinator. Camera flashes flickered briefly across the chandeliers. Victoria's face tightened the instant she saw them. Who authorized media access? She demanded sharply. One of Ethan's executives answered calmly. The story is already public. Refusing comment now would look worse. Naomi instinctively stepped backward. She hated cameras, hated attention, hated rooms where people suddenly cared about her because the internet told them to. Ethan noticed immediately. You do not have to do this. Tonight. Naomi watched the reporters setting up near the ballroom entrance. One young female journalist held a tablet displaying photos from the highway rescue earlier that afternoon beside headlines about the foundation announcement. Naomi let out a quiet breath. No, her voice remained soft, but steadier now. If they are finally paying attention to emergency workers, then maybe this matters more than being uncomfortable. Ethan's eyes softened with unmistakable admiration. Across the ballroom, Leonard Mercer overheard her answer and slowly smiled to himself. Meanwhile, Victoria's control over the evening continued slipping away in visible pieces. Several donors who had once orbited around her now approached Naomi directly instead, asking questions about ambulance shortages, trauma equipment, and volunteer staffing programs in rural towns. They were listening to her with genuine focus. Not because she married Ethan Vale, because she knew things they did not. Cassandra noticed it too. She walked toward the bar and finished an entire glass of wine in silence before quietly leaving the ballroom altogether. Nobody stopped her. Near the staircase, one of the younger servers approached Naomi nervously. "Ma'am," he said softly, "my dad is a paramedic in New Hampshire." Naomi turned toward him immediately. "How is he holding up?" The server blinked, surprised. She asked. "Honestly, not great." Naomi nodded knowingly. "Most of them are not." The young man swallowed hard before saying, "Thank you for what you are doing." Naomi gave him the same tired half-smile she gave frightened patients before ambulances pulled away from crash scenes. Simple, human, real. And several wealthy guests watching nearby suddenly understood why the room trusted her more than the family born inside the mansion itself. The gala finally began, dissolving sometime after 1 in the morning. Luxury cars disappeared down the long, rain-darkened driveway while exhausted staff quietly cleared untouched desserts and wilted flower arrangements from tables that had once been arranged with military precision. The mansion still glowed against the Connecticut night, but the energy inside it had changed. Permanently. Naomi stood outside beneath the massive front archway again, though this time no one was asking her to leave. Cool air drifted through the estate grounds carrying the scent of wet stone and pine trees. Her EMT jacket rested folded over one arm now, while Ethan's coat remained around her shoulders. Somewhere in the distance, the helicopter crew prepared for departure, their voices faint beneath the quiet hum of the estate generators. Ethan stepped beside her, holding 2 small paper containers from the kitchen. "They were throwing out the apple pie," he said simply. Naomi looked at him in disbelief for half a second before laughing quietly under her breath. It was the first genuine laugh she had managed all night. "You stole pie from your own gala?" Ethan shrugged. "Technically, that makes it borrowing." They sat together on the cold stone steps overlooking the long driveway, while the enormous mansion behind them slowly emptied of donors and reporters. For a while, neither of them spoke. Naomi ate slowly, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline completely now. Her hands still carried faint traces of dried antiseptic near her wrists from the highway rescue earlier that day. Ethan noticed, like he always noticed things other people missed. "You should sleep for a week after today," he murmured. Naomi stared out toward the dark tree line beyond the estate gates. "Tomorrow morning, I have a 6 a.m. shift." Ethan shook his head softly, somewhere between admiration and disbelief. A black sedan rolled slowly down the driveway toward the front gates. Through the back window, Naomi caught a glimpse of Victoria sitting silently inside. For one brief moment, Mother and daughter-in-law locked eyes through the rain-speckled glass. Victoria looked away first. The car disappeared into the darkness without another word. Naomi exhaled slowly. I do not think she will ever like me. Ethan leaned back against the stone pillar behind them. Maybe not. He paused. But tonight was never really about being liked. The estate had grown almost completely quiet now. No orchestra. No speeches. No forced laughter bouncing off marble floors. Just rainwater dripping softly from the old rooftop gutters and the distant spinning blades of the helicopter waiting nearby. Naomi looked down at the folded EMT jacket in her lap. Less than 8 hours earlier, she had been kneeling on broken asphalt beside an overturned vehicle while rain mixed with gasoline beneath flashing emergency lights. Then she had walked into one of the wealthiest homes in Connecticut and somehow felt even more out of place there than at an active crash scene. The thought almost made her smile again. You know what is strange? She said softly. Ethan glanced toward her. Tonight, I kept thinking I was the wrong kind of person for this world. She looked back toward the mansion glowing behind them. But honestly, I think this world might be the wrong kind of world for a lot of people. Ethan did not answer immediately, because deep down, he knew she was right. Far beyond the estate gates, ambulance sirens echoed faintly somewhere across the sleeping Connecticut hills. Naomi instinctively lifted her head toward the sound before it faded back into the night. Some habits never left people like her. Ethan watched her quietly then. This tired woman with worn boots, wind-tangled blonde hair, and the kind of dignity that could not be bought, inherited, or staged for cameras. Inside the mansion, generations of family portraits still lined the walls beneath gold chandeliers. But out here on the cold stone steps, something far more valuable had survived the night. And long after the headlines disappeared and the ballroom lights went dark, people would remember exactly who stood in the rain and who did not.